Hi, everyone. Welcome to Riot's Lunch and Learn series. My name is Caroline Griffin. I'm Director of Operations for the Riot organization, and you found us, the place where we feature all of Riot's partners. Today, I am super excited to have Kat Bernardi and Steve Leah here with us today to talk about wireless regulatory compliance, how to get your product to market, North America, Europe, and beyond. A couple of quick reminders before I hand it over to Steve. This session is being recorded. It will be posted to Riot's YouTube channel and then shared out via the meetup group where you registered for this event. If you have any questions, I encourage you to utilize the chat box. We will get all of your questions answered at the end of the presentation. And at that time, you will also be able to unmute yourself and ask questions openly if that's something you're interested in. And the last reminder is the best way to view this presentation is in speaker view. So if you go up to the top and hit view and hit speaker view, that'll give you a nice big view of the presentation, and then the speaker in a smaller box on the right. But without further ado, I am so excited again to have the Global Validity and Elite teams here with us today, and I will hand it over to Steve.
Thank you, Caroline. I appreciate it. And thanks to everybody for taking time out of your schedule to attend this event. And again, yep, my name is Steve Leah, and I'll be talking to you today about wireless regulatory compliance. And let me see if I can advance. There we go. And I am of the duo here. I am the side on Elite and Elite Electronic Engineering. Just real quick, we are an EMC, an environmental stress test laboratory. We are in the Chicago area and been around for a while, but our services, we focus obviously a lot on regulatory compliance testing, and we do all the testing. We are also a certification body in this area too. So we are a FCC Canada European Union certification body, and the range of our services certainly include consumer products, industrial, automotive, truck, construction, military, aerospace, a whole bunch of things at Elite. I've been Elite for about 25 years now. I have an engineering background, and it's always an interesting place to work at a test lab. You see a lot of different things, but I would say in my years, one of the things that's really gotten me excited has been wireless technology, just the range of technology, the adoption of it. It's a very exciting part of our business to be in right now, and there's a lot going on. So my goal today is, again, the first half of this presentation is to talk about the regulatory requirements for North America and the European Union, or in Europe. The second half of this will kind of address the rest of it, the rest of the world, and how do you get your product into markets everywhere, basically. But in particular, the second half of the conversation will go into global market access, the rest of the world. Do you need a certification for your product? What does certification mean? And then what might be some top technology that's available to you today to help make that process a little bit easier. So I'll start off by saying that I'll talk here about specifically North America, and in particular USA and Canada, kind of leaving Mexico out at this point. That falls a little bit more in the everywhere else bucket. I'll talk about Europe, and in particular the CE mark, as you may have heard about the CE mark for Europe, but the CE mark applies to the 27 member states of the European Union. And then there are 4 countries noted here: Iceland, Norway, Liechtenstein, Switzerland, that are technically, they are not part of the European Union. They are part of the EFTA, European Free Trade Association. But together, these 31 countries adopt the CE mark as their compliance label. And that implies compliance with a whole series of directives and obligations for manufacturers. The other one noted there is the UK. As everybody knows, the United Kingdom used to be part of the European Union, and they left about 2 years ago. So in this context, the UK applies only to England, Wales, and Scotland. So those 3 countries, they products that are sold in those countries will need to bear the UKCA mark. Now, it turns out that when the UK left the European Union, they established this different mark, but smartly, they adopted all of the same compliance requirements. I'd say 99.99% of them are the same, at least from what most of our customers would have to contend with. So basically, it would be one series of tests, one compliance process, and you would apply the CE label and UKCA label more or less equally. Obviously, that there are some differences in terms of what those regulations are called now, but technically they're basically the same. And then everywhere else, there's 157 countries that remain, beyond North America and Europe. And Asia certainly headed up by Australia, China, the big economies out there, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan. Latin and South America, Brazil being the bigger, Brazil and Mexico, the big economies there, and then Africa and the Middle East. So there's a lot. There's a lot associated with regulatory compliance. Not only is the breadth of it, the fact that most countries around the world, they have some very specific requirements now. And it's difficult for manufacturers that want to bring products to market to understand all of these rules and regulations and apply them properly. So we'll talk about that here. But the first part of this, again, I'm going to focus in on, I'll start with North America and talk about some of the regulations for North America. And I'll begin with EMC and Spectrum requirements. This presentation, I apologize in advance for this. There are a lot of acronyms in here, and I understand that maybe a lot of folks might not be familiar with all of these acronyms, so I'll take a little bit of time here to explain what some of these are. So EMC is electromagnetic compatibility. It's this concept that electronics in particular need to survive in their electromagnetic environment. So they can't emit radio waves, either purposely or unintentionally. They can't emit radio waves to interfere with other devices, and in particular, other receivers. And they have to accept a certain amount of ambient radiation. So the idea being that, hey, what if I take my cell phone and I hold my cell phone right to my laptop computer in front of me? Is that computer going to respond to it? So EMC kind of encompasses what radio interference emits from your product, and can it handle it? And what it can handle is not just radio waves, but also electrostatic discharge. In many cases, the voltage pulses that you might see from a nearby lightning strike. There's a lot of different sorts of electromagnetic threats that electrical and electronic products have to survive. That's all encompassed in EMC. The other part of the spectrum is if you have an intentional transmitter, so you're using a Wi-Fi or Bluetooth transmitter, you have to transmit at a certain power. You have to stay on a particular channel. You can't bleed off into others and interfere with others. So that's really what this first topic or the first line is talking about here, EMC and Spectrum. That's what we do at Elite, and I'll talk more about that in detail. But again, the FCC is the US regulatory body that makes these rules and requirements for most products. It's a Federal Communication Commission. ISED Canada is Innovation, Science, and Economic Development. That's the counterpart in Canada. Those are the folks that make the rules. So beyond EMC and Spectrum, if you're a manufacturer of product, you probably also have to consider safety concerns too. And safety in this context would be electrical safety. Organizations that create rules for these would be, here in the United States, would be OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. The NEC is a National Electrical Code. So if you're buying equipment for your home, municipalities, cities, states, in many cases set the NEC, the National Electrical Code, as the rule for having safe products in the home. Similarly, in Canada, the Standards Council of Canada, they create very similar safety requirements as what we have here in the United States. And what's not noted here is that sometimes safety is mandated by the end customer. A lot of the big box stores, Best Buy, Lowe's, they'll mandate safety labels, often that you'll see like a UL label, an Intertech label, a QPS label. They'll mandate those labels on their products because that's what they want in order for your product to be sold in their stores and on their shelves. So beyond that, there are some other government regulations. If you're making a medical electronic device, you probably have to comply with the FDA. Selling it to the military, maybe the Department of Defense, you'd have some rules and regulations for that. If it's a marine device, you might have to comply with the U.S. Coast Guard requirements for marine devices. Whole sets of other things that you could really kind of go on and on. I won't spend too much time on those, but they're there. You have to be aware of them. And then there's another set of industry regulations. So if you are integrating a Bluetooth transmitter in your device, the Bluetooth Special Interest Group, or the Bluetooth SIG, has industry regulations that protect their brand. So if you're using Bluetooth radio, even if you're not putting that Bluetooth insignia or logo on there, if you're using Bluetooth IP, you're going to need to register your Bluetooth application on the Bluetooth SIG database. If you're integrating a cellular radio and you're going to be using that radio on the AT&T or T-Mobile network, you're probably going to have to do some work with the PTCRB. It's an industry group that evaluates how the cellular radio works and on. So there are many different countries, many different regulations. We're going to try to focus just on the EMC spectrum side, at least here first, for what would you need to do for North America. And here too, it kind of depends on what your product is. Is your product considered an unintentional radiator? Is your electronic product considered an unintentional radiator, or is it an intentional transmitter? Examples of unintentional radiators would be any kind of a digital device. So a microprocessor, anything that's transmitting data, serial, parallel, anything like that is going to be a digital device. Any switch mode power supplies. So this picture up on the right here, this little charging system here. Brush commutated motor is an example of that, would be a little portable hand tool. Receivers. Example would be a car audio system that has an AM/FM radio in it, and certain lighting equipment like fluorescent lights are all examples of unintentional radiators. If your part only has those things in it, then you're probably going to have to comply with the rules for unintentional radiators here in the United States and Canada. But if you're putting something in your device that's intentionally transmitting information, so Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, cellular, your own kind of transmitter, that is going to require another set of compliance steps. Other types of intentional transmitters might be radio determination equipment. So radar would be kind of a big one on there, or finding, finding buried pipes or things behind walls. Some RF is used for those purposes. Those are intentional transmitters. Excuse me. So we kind of divide intentional transmitters into two different versions, at least here in the United States, and a lot of countries around the world. We talk about modular transmitters, or transmitters that are certified as modular devices. And so this concept, if you can see this little illustration on the lower right, you'll see that it's kind of this bare circuit board, and you can barely make out there that there's a little chip on there. That's probably the radio itself, and you can kind of see a little bit of an outline of what likely is the antenna there. So that's very much of a non-modular transmitter, and that's going to get embedded into some more purposeful end product. But if you kind of contrast that with this illustration on the right here, you'll see it's kind of a similar thing, except this one has this metal enclosure over it, and it seems like it's a little bit more buttoned up. And in fact, that is what sort of constitutes a modular transmitter. There's about 8 things that transmitter manufacturers have to do to make them modular, and but that makes for a significant advantage for integrators of radio devices, that if you can find a modular transmitter and integrate that into your end product, there's generally far less testing and certification that you're going to have to do for that product. So we'll talk about modular versus non-modular transmitters a little bit more. So very quickly here, the steps to compliance. If you have one of those unintentional radiators, your switch mode power supplies, that process is what's called generally a supplier declaration of conformity. Again, we're not using this word certification. So if you have an unintentional radiator, generally you're not certifying that device for North America. It's a declaration of conformity. You're making a declaration of conformity. And the steps to that other than determining the requirements, is you're probably going to have to get a sample, make measurements of conducted and radiated RF emissions. You'll have to label the product, put some information in the user's manual, and then you're pretty well done. It's a relatively straightforward process, assuming that you can meet these technical conducted and radiated emissions requirements. Steps to compliance for intentional transmitters, get to be a little bit more involved, and it depends again on what type of a transmitter you're incorporating. If it's a modular type, modular transmitters also are generally not considered, the end product is generally not considered certified because the module itself is certified. So when you're incorporating a certified modular transmitter into your device, that process that you have to do then to kind of finish your installation of this is what's called supplier declaration of conformity, right? So you've taken that modular transmitter, you've put it in your host product, and you're ready to go. What do I have to do to get this thing compliant? It's issue a supplier declaration of conformity. Again, not certification. But the steps of that mean that you're going to make sure that you've read the grant notes, the certification notes, that you're using the right antenna. You're not using it any closer to the user than what you should be. You do some testing, again, conducted radiated emissions. Maybe you turn their transmitter on and you spot check a little bit the transmitter to make sure it's still compliant. Put a label on it, and then you're put some information in the user's manual, and you're ready to go. You're ready for market. Again, in this process here, where you're using a modular transmitter, modular certified transmitter in your host product, that is that equipment authorization process you go through is not a certification. It would be still a supplier declaration conformity, assuming you kind of follow all the steps of integrating it properly here. However, if you're integrating a non-modular transmitter, that's a different story. You're going to have to file an application with a TCB, a telecommunications certification body, or a conformity assessment body. You're going to have to make measurements of conducted and radiated emissions along with, full testing of the transmitter. So now you're going to be measuring how much transmit power is this radio putting out? What is its occupied bandwidth? If it's a frequency hopping transmitter, is it hopping properly? But you'll have to label, once you get all that testing finished, you'll have to label it, put information in the user's manual, and then you have a certified end product, an FCC and Canada certified end product. And those would be the steps there for North America. Let me move on to the EU and the EFTA. So kind of taking a look at that approach, or that process, there's something called, in Europe, they have something called the set of new approach directives. And the new approach directives are the CE marking directives. And there's actually 23 of these, there's 23 different directives. I'm only showing 8 of them here. And it's the obligation of a manufacturer that you look at all 23 and figure out, does your product fit within, which of those directives your product fits in. I would say that most of our clients are looking at these 8. And we'll help them determine which ones they need to comply with. Certain products, just like in North America, certain products fall outside the scope of these new approach directives in the CE mark. And for that, there are commission regulations. So for example, in our lab, we do a lot of automotive testing in our lab, and products that go onto cars and trucks and buses. For example, a car is not CE marked, a bus is not CE marked. In Europe, cars, trucks, buses are E marked. And that is a certification process. It's not a manufacturer self-declaration. But other things, marine equipment, in certain cases is not CE marked. It's type certified, and there's a different, this kind of, they call this the wheel mark for marine equipment. But other things, pharmaceuticals, there are many different commission regulations. So as a manufacturer, you kind of have to really scope out the entire range of things that may be applicable to you. In Europe as well, there are military, there's aerospace, public safety regulations that, kind of are outside the scope of the CE mark. You have to consider those. And then in Europe, similarly here in North America, there are some very similar industry regulations. for Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, cellular. This is maybe a little bit of an error in Europe. It might not be the PTCRB. It might be another organization that deals with that in Europe. But so let's look a little bit more closely at what you would have to do for your product if you wanted to have that product CE mark. Again, there's a series of directives that probably are going to apply if you have an electronic product. If you have an electronic product that includes a microprocessor, any sort of digital device, brush commutated motors, kind of like what we saw on that first list of unintentional radiators for the FCC, then your product is probably, and if your product does not include a radio, then it's probably just going to require compliance with the EMC directive alone. If your product, however, operates at hazardous live voltage, which is generally considered greater than 50 volts AC or greater than 75 volts DC, if your product operates at hazardous live voltage, then you're probably also going to have to comply with the low voltage directive. So battery powered devices, for example, something battery powered is going to be more than likely less than 75 volts DC. So if you have a battery powered electronic device that does not have a radio in it, it may just be the EMC directive that you'll have to comply with. Again, because if it's battery powered and if the batteries are less than 75 volts DC, then this directive won't apply. But as soon as you kind of go over these thresholds, 50 volts AC, 75 volts DC, there's a little bit more work there. The other directive that we're going to talk about here is the radio equipment directive. And this one applies anytime your product includes a radio. And in Europe, a radio is anything that's a communications radio. So certainly Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, cellular falls in that batch. Radar, radio locating, like I had talked before, or any kind of a receiver. So this would be like an AM/FM radio. You have any of those elements, a GPS in your device, then your product then becomes a radio equipment directive product, and in a way that sort of supersedes maybe these other two over here. All right. So steps to compliance if your product falls within the EMC directive or the low voltage directive. All right, so this assumes that you do not have a wireless transmitter or a receiver in your product, and you're only within the EMC or low voltage directive. Then in Europe, it is a manufacturer declaration of conformity. That's typically not a certification of any sort. It is your self-declaration that you're compliant, that you meet all of the applicable directives, you figured out all of the harmonized standards that you needed to meet, and you did perhaps some EMC testing, you did some safety testing, some electrical safety testing for the low voltage directive, that you prepared a declaration of conformity, you labeled the product with the CE mark, and you put some information for the user in the manual, some safety information in there. You follow all of these steps and your product is ready for Europe. I'll mention here too, in this presentation, I've just illustrated the CE mark here. If you go through all of these steps here and you follow basically the same harmonized standards, if you're going to be selling the product in the in the UK, in addition to the CE mark, you're also going to have to put the UKCA label on there. I haven't included that little label here, just it might make things a little confusing, but just be aware that what I'm describing here basically covers the UKCA label as well. So these are the compliance steps specifically for the EMC directive and low voltage directive manufacturer self-declaration. So let's take a look at the steps for the radio equipment directive. And so the steps in a sense are nearly identical. Identify the applicable directives, all right, well, we figured out that the radio equipment directive, I have a transmitter, Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, GPS in my device. Okay, that's it. I fall under the radio equipment directive. I worked with my lab to figure out, what harmonized standards I have to apply. I did the safety testing. I did some EMC testing. I did some spectrum stuff. I'm all, I got all my reports. I'm all good with that. So then your next step is you prepare a declaration of conformity. You label the product and you include information in the user's manual. What's unique about Europe is that this process is a manufacturer self-declaration for a radio transmitter. And that's one where even you're not necessarily using this sort of concept of a modular transmitter in Europe. So it's unique in that in Europe, even non-modular radios are self-declared compliant by the manufacturer. You don't necessarily need to have a certification in Europe. It's a very different sort of approach. Almost every country around the world, when you have a transmitter, there's going to be some sort of a certification associated with it, either at the module level or at the finished product level. But in Europe, under the Radio Equipment Directive, devices are issued a manufacturer's self-declaration of conformity, not necessarily a certification. There are some unique situations where that may be necessary. I'll talk about those in a second, but in almost all cases, certainly in our lab, Radio Equipment Directive conformity is done as a manufacturer self-declaration. So one thing I did want to address here is this Radio Equipment Directive. There, just talk a little bit more about these stages here, and I'm running out of my time here a little bit. What's unique about the Radio Directive, I mentioned before when I was talking about the low voltage side of things, that only applies for products that are operating at more than 50 volts AC or more than 75 volts DC. When it comes to the Radio Equipment Directive, it doesn't matter what your voltage limit applies or what your voltage limit on your product is. All radio equipment, any product that falls under the scope of the Radio Equipment Directive has to have a safety assessment. And a lot of our customers kind of find that a little bit surprising, and it kind of short circuits a little bit of their plans there. So looking a little bit more of these things, again, under the Radio Equipment Directive, safety is required for all Radio Equipment Directive products. There is no voltage limit excluding you from having to do a safety test. Anything, whether it's a dime cell battery in it, you have to get a safety assessment done on the finished product. In fact, I've noted here, safety testing has to be performed on the final assembly. It can't just be done on the radio element itself. It has, the safety assessment for your product has to be done on your final assembly. I've got a note here. I might want to suggest a CB scheme safety report. A CB scheme, maybe take a look at that on the internet. It helps you leverage, it's becoming more and more of a requirement. It's not a necessity for the European Union, but the CB scheme style safety report tends to be more of a global need nowadays. And Kat will talk about that next in the global certification side of things about CB scheme safety reports. EMC testing, again, EMC testing, you're going to have to do that for your finished product. It has to be done on the final assembly. Spectrum testing, the best thing that you can do is to leverage an existing report for the radio module or the radio product you're putting into your host. If that exists, talk to your radio module manufacturer and ask them if they have a current compliance report that addresses the spectrum rules for Europe, because you can leverage that. And it's important that you leverage that because you're going to save tremendous cost and time. If you you will have to perform testing on the radio module, in particular those tests at the antenna port, if you've made changes to the module in your integration of it, or if you just can't get that data. If the radio module manufacturer says, I'm not going to give it to you, then you may have to do these spectrum tests on the radio module yourself, or certainly contract with a lab to do it. Your other obligation is to perform some radiated emissions on the final assembly. And in many cases, that means taking your radio, turning your radio on at some specific channels. If you got a Wi-Fi radio, we would turn it on to channel 13, and then we would spot check while your transmitter is transmitting at channel 13 to make sure that it's not interfering or it's compliant at other frequencies. If you've changed the antenna, if you've put a module in there and you've got all of this existing radio module report from your radio module provider, but you've selected a different antenna, then you're probably going to have to do more of this radiated emissions testing to have a complete report. One last thing I'll say is notified bodies required for non-harmonized standards. So these non-harmonized standards typically is for new technology. So for example, Wi-Fi 6 is new and those standards are not quite harmonized. So this would be the only time that you're really obligated to certify the product, and that's through a notified body, is if you're using a non-harmonized standard, which is generally associated with kind of newer technology. All right, and keep in mind too that there are some special requirements for radio equipment. These are still coming out that deal with cybersecurity and data protection. We'll have more information certainly on our website talking about those things. So some summary takeaways here. I'll say that, you know, for the FCC in Canada, understand the difference between unintentional radiators and using modular transmitters, that those are authorized as a declaration of conformity, that only intentional transmitters that have not been certified require certification. And keep in mind that certainly there are other safety and other regulations that comply with. For Europe, it's your obligation to look at all of the applicable directives. Yeah, there are quite a few to consider. Again, work with your lab to figure out what directives apply, what standards apply. We're always very helpful with that guidance. Keep in mind too that safety applies for any radio equipment directive product. There is no voltage limit applying with that. And then again, most radios are going to be a self-declaration, not a type approval certification. So I'll maybe leave it there and turn things over to Kat. And maybe what we'll do is we'll, if you guys are all right, we can save some time at the end of Kat's presentation to field questions, because I know I've gone through a lot of information here very quickly. So why don't, Kat, why don't I send it over to you, and if you want to take the next step here,
sure.
Next presentation.
Yeah, definitely. Just, do you mind just handing the screen share over to me, Steve? That would be great.
Sure. Let me see, Kat.
Right up at the top, there should be a stop sharing. Click on view options, Steve, and then it should be a drop down that says stop participant sharing.
There we go.
Perfect. You caught me drinking my water. Let me share my screen here. All right. Hopefully we can see my screen okay. Steve, just let me know real quick. Can you see my screen?
Yes, I can, Kat.
Okay, perfect. All right, wonderful. So hi, everyone. My name is Kat Venardi. I am the Director of Operations for Global Validity. I am today just going to talk a little bit about global market access and what to expect when obtaining global regulatory approvals around the world. So Steve did a great job kind of explaining the US and the European Union requirements. Now we're going to talk about the rest of the world. So if I can get my, okay, so first, let's just chat a little bit about who Global Validity is. Global Validity was founded in 2018, but our whole team evolved from the testing, inspection, and certification industry. We call that the TIC industry. We wanted to develop a cloud-based, tech-enabled global regulatory certification platform that really gives manufacturers a collaborative, secure, and reliable way to manage all of their product approvals around the world. Our Access Manager platform, we call it Access Manager, supports 200 countries and territories around the world. And again, the entire process from start to finish is actually managed through our platform. It's really the only platform on the market today that will help manage the entire process end to end. So global market access, what is it? Outside of the European Union and North America, which is the US and Canada, there are around 200 countries and territories that also have very specific product certification requirements. The certification requirements do vary and are highly dependent on your product and the functionality of your product, but they are mandatory. They're legal and they're very strictly enforced at customs. So it's extremely important to know exactly what certifications your products require when you're importing your products to these global markets. Unlike the FCC, the vast majority of countries do not accept modular approval. So they are going to be expecting that you're certifying the end product or the host device. So even if you're purchasing a pre-approved module, excuse me, you're going to need to apply for a certification for that end product. The same goes for family approvals as well. So many countries around the world do require per model approvals, meaning you're going to have a certificate for each model. There are some countries as well that do accept family approvals. So one certificate that covers each model in a family or each variant in a family. So that's why it's really, really important to be working with a test lab like Elite, who is very experienced with global approvals and is accredited, of course, so that they can help you when you're going through that FCC and CE testing phase to understand, where you're going in the rest of the world. And how to really create your test reports so that if those countries and the rest of the world do accept family approvals, you're able to support those family approvals with the correct test reports. So what type of products do require regulatory certifications? Well, I will start off by saying that anything that has a wireless component to it is likely subject to a radio certification outside of the European Union and FCC. So all of these countries, these 200 countries around the world, do not accept or recognize the FCC or CE mark. And in fact, they also have their own labeling requirements. A lot of these countries, you'll see the NOM marking for Mexico. For example, you will see these different requirements that you must have a special marking on your product. Different product types that do require certification, anything from consumer to heavy equipment, telematics, automotive, all of these different product types do require certification. But knowing what kinds of certifications your product needs will depend on the functionality, the technical specification of your product. And when we are talking about certifications, we are referring to radio certification, safety, EMC. There are also security and encryption requirements, and RoHS WE equivalent in some of the countries around the world. So the good thing about Global Validity is we will walk you through the entire process, and we will really get you ready for launching your product globally. So what to expect? Global market access is largely a paperwork exercise. And what that means is we will work with you to understand exactly what requirements your products must meet in each country and develop a very specific document checklist. And those checklists usually consist of test reports, whether they be CE or FCC test reports, technical specifications, photographs, user manuals, all different types of documents, including CB certificates if your product does require a safety certificate, a safety certification, excuse me. There are certain countries like South Africa who are very strict with ensuring that you have a CB certificate to support your product. So as I mentioned, most of the countries around the world do work off of a paperwork exercise. However, there are certain countries that do also require in-country testing. So that means that they will not leverage or recognize CE or FCC data. You'll often see this happening with Mexico, Brazil, China even. So you will be asked to actually send samples in country for testing. And the scope of testing will vary depending on the requirements that your products must comply with. Some countries will perform pretty comprehensive testing like Brazil, but there's other countries actually like the Ivory Coast, for example, who are just going to be asking for samples for visual inspection purposes. So they're going to ask for you to send your samples directly to the country. They'll take your samples, really evaluate them, look at them, take some photographs to be placed inside of the application, and then they will send that off for your approval. And all of this documentation review is done at the certification body level. So what Global Validity does is we work with a network of highly qualified certification suppliers and agents all around the world to understand the requirements, submit all of your documents, submit your test samples, and get your certification applications approved. In fact, our Access Manager platform helps to really coordinate and organize all of that. And in fact, you as a manufacturer would be able to gain access to our platform to have direct access to those suppliers as well, so that you can have expertise on the ready. You can request questions, you can request information, you can ask for quotes, and you can really understand exactly what your product requires in all of the countries that you're looking to launch to. So that kind of goes into how to know if your product requires certification. So of course, contact Global Validity. We can always support you, but our team will work with you to understand your product. And actually our Access Manager platform will help prompt you to enter in the exact details you need to provide in order to get an accurate certification quote. And the reason why that is so important is because change is constant as it relates to global market access. As I'm sure most of you know or have experienced, regulatory scopes do evolve. We see it happen with the CE and FCC testing all the time. We're seeing that with the rest of the world as well. So it's extremely important to know exactly what requirements your products must meet at the time that you're looking to ship into that country. Getting prepared, understanding the requirements at an early enough stage will also help a very seamless transition into that certification phase for the rest of the world. So again, our platform will connect you directly to those very experienced certification suppliers, but our team is here to help you as well. We'll work with them. You will obtain certification quotes that will outline exactly what certifications you need, along with the corresponding documentation, testing requirements, lead times, and of course, the associated certification costs. Now, I mentioned lead times because it's really important to consider that every country around the world has a different lead time. Those lead times can range from 30 days to 120 days. It just depends on where you're going. So it's very important to take that into consideration when you're starting to plan for your product launch. So just like lead times, post-certification management, all of these certificates will also expire at different times. Expirations do range from 6 months to 10 years. Luckily, there are some countries that do have indefinite certificates, but you do need to ensure that you are keeping track of those certificates very closely, because as those expiration dates do approach, you want to make sure that those renewal applications are submitted well in advance. So luckily, our Access Manager platform does come with a certificate tracking tool. You as the manufacturer will be notified prior to the expiration date, and you can actually manage the entire renewal process directly through our Access Manager platform. The renewal process becomes very streamlined, and there's a lot of transparency and control that comes along with that, because you want to make sure that those certificates are always valid. Mexico, for example, is extremely focused on checking certifications at the time of import. So as you reach that customs barrier, they're going to check your product and they're going to compare the certifications that you have to ensure that you do meet all of those regulations and you are free to ship your products into the country. So I've talked a lot about Access Manager and really just the high level requirements for global market access, because as I mentioned, change is constant as it relates to global market access, and the requirements are highly product dependent. But the main takeaway is really to ensure that you are going through that initial CE and FCC testing phase with a trusted partner like Elite, so that you ensure that you have the correct testing data, you have accounted for all of the country deviations that you may need for the standards that you're testing to, and that you have a complete package of technical documentation ready to submit to these countries. And that's exactly what Global Validity wanted to focus on supporting, is that process. We have worked, as I mentioned, in the industry for a number of years. Personally, I was a project manager for global certifications for 10 years, and most of that process has traditionally been done over email. But we wanted to create a platform that automates that process as much as possible. We didn't change the process. The application and submission process is still the same, but we did create a lot of efficiency and a lot of automation. We wanted to bring that innovation to the global market access market and allow manufacturers to really take back control. So your product launch really does depend on it. And we do want to invite you, whoops, I'm going to go back to this last screen here. Do want to invite you to our website, www.globalvalidity.com. We have a great 2-minute video on our website that will give you a high-level kind of overview of our platform and the functionality and all of the different features. And our LinkedIn page. We are posting some content on our LinkedIn that will show you a little bit of a more deeper look into our platform so that you can see the process and the workflows. But of course, you can always also contact Global Validity for a demo. So I know that was very high level for global market access, but I wanted to make sure that we got in some questions. If anybody has any specific questions as it relates to product launches globally or within the US and the European Union. So Caroline, I wanted to maybe hand it over to you real quick, just to see if there's any questions that we might want to take.
Thank you so much, Kat, and thank you, Steve. I do not see any questions in the chat box. You all were very helpful. And so at this time, I would like to ask if anybody has any questions. Please do put those in the chat box. You are also welcome to unmute yourself and ask questions that way as well. Don't be shy. All right. Very thorough presentation, no questions. All right. Oh, Don, I see you unmuted yourself. Do you have a question?
Yes. Not a question. I just like to thank you. We are in the process of launching a industrial IoT product. We are developing this in Brazil, and we are planning to launch here in the US. So it was really useful. Thank you very much.
That's awesome. Thanks, Don. Yeah, great, very great presentation from Steve and Kat, so thank you. All right. Kat, Steve, what is the best way, again, for anyone to reach you with additional questions, or maybe if they want to learn more?
Yeah, so we do have a contact us page on our website, but you can also contact us at support@globalvalidity.com. That is probably the fastest way to connect with us, but again, we do have a contact us page on our website as well.
Amazing. I just put that in the chat box.
Yep. And same at Elite, just certainly www.elitetest.com, and just navigate through our website to the contact us page, and we'll reply back with whatever questions you may have.
Amazing. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.
All right. Well, again, I would like to thank Kat and Steve for this wonderful presentation, and the entire Global Validity team for helping set this up. As a reminder, this was recorded, so you can go back and reference it. I know there was a lot of information, so you will be able to find that on the meetup page where you registered and on Riot's YouTube channel. And I wish everybody a wonderful day. Thanks again, y'all. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.